Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. About a week ago, I did a preview or first impressions video of the Anbernic RG405V, and in that video I said I needed about a week to test it and try it out in different scenarios to make sure I knew whether or not it's going to be worth purchasing. And this video here is going to be exactly that. Now in that first video, I covered a lot of the topics that I will usually do in my reviews. How the buttons feel, just the ergonomics and performance, all those kind of things are already well covered in that previous video. In this video here, I really want to focus on just a few different factors. Number one, I want to talk about the software experience in case this is your very first handheld. For example, what happens if you buy one of those SD cards and put it inside? How do you actually play those games? Next, I want to do a comparison against similarly priced models that all have the same chipset. So we'll be looking at 4 devices altogether, just to kind of narrow it down in case you're trying to decide between one of these. And finally, I'll give my own thoughts about whether or not I would personally purchase this device myself and whether I think it's going to be a good fit for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, to start, when I first made my preview video, I didn't know what the price was going to be, and I remember guessing that it was going to be between $150 and $200. Well, as you can see here, it is listed at $138 retail before shipping, so really it is going to be a little bit less than $150 depending on where you live. And I do think that's a competitive price compared to other devices with the same chipset on the market. Now, one thing about Anbernic devices is that they also will ship it with an additional SD card if you would like. And these will come preloaded with games. We'll talk about that here later in the video, but it will also bring up the price, as you can see. And I'm hoping the experience that I show you in this video will help you make a decision of whether or not it's going to be worth that upgraded cost. Now, in addition to the wood panel model that you saw in the preview video, there are 2 other colors. There's a gray one that kind of looks like a DMG Game Boy, and they also have a transparent purple model that kind of looks like the atomic purple Game Boy Color. Now, there's 2 places to buy the device right now. You can get it from Anbernic.com directly, and you will pay that additional shipping. However, they also have it on AliExpress, which is a Chinese retailer. This is also directly from Anbernic, but the pricing's a little bit different. Here, they'll charge a little bit more upfront, but the shipping is free. And if you combine this with coupons that they sometimes have on the website, you can actually get this for cheaper here on AliExpress. Either way, I will leave links to all this down below in case you want to check out the pricing for you in your region. Now, before we get too far into the weeds, let's go into some of the basic specs of the RG405V. I'm going to break this off into 3 different chunks, starting with those that we kind of expected with this device. Number 1, it's running a T618 chipset. This is a household name at this point. Last time I checked, I think there's about 6 of these devices on the market, and they're all around the $150 price range. This is an Android-based device with Android 12, and this is the second device we've seen with a 4-inch 480p 4:3 aspect ratio screen. In terms of other hardware features, we've got 4 gigs of LPDDR4X RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage. It also has a microSD card slot to expand that. And then finally, it does feature 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0. Now, the next category are things that are unique to this device. First, we have a 5500 mAh battery. That's bigger than the others and will give you an average about 8 or 9 hours of gameplay. This one also features ergonomic grips built in. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. And then, of course, this is the only device within this chipset that has a vertical orientation. So if you're looking for that Game Boy form factor, this is it. Now, I'm going to show off a lot of things in this video that are both good and bad, but there are 2 bummers that stand out that I need to address. The first is this device does not have an HDMI port. Now, many others within this chipset do, so it is kind of a bummer. If you are looking to play this on a bigger screen, your only option is to screencast it, and that can cause some inherent delays. And then finally, I went into this in detail in my preview video, but there is some over-sharpening happening with this screen. It is software related, so if we get a software fix down the line, this could be fixed. All the same, those are 2 issues that I identified in my first video, and they still remain here. Now, in my preview video, I did a whole unboxing experience, but I got a second RG405V in the mail. This one's the gray model, and so I'm going to go through the full experience again, but this time around, this one came with an SD card, and so I want to go through that process in case you've never tried that before. Now, a couple things I noticed about the gray model over the wood one that I showed in my preview video. This one has a little bit different of a texture. The plastic itself has a little bit of grit to it, just like the previous model, but has a more glossy finish. And so while the wood one kind of had a soft matte feel, this one's just a tiny bit slick. I would still say that it's a very good plastic texture, but it is a little bit different, just a little bit shinier. And honestly, I think it's a great fit for this model, so I have no complaints. Now, like with the others, this one has glossy buttons and they are monochromatic. We'll talk more about the coloring here in a moment. First, I just want to re-emphasize here that this has been built with ergonomics in mind, and that's not something that is often done with Anbernic products. You can see on the back they've molded these new grips. They're at a bit of an angle, and they also have these little pinky indentations here at the bottom. And the idea here is that you can grip them with your fingers instead of having that flat experience, which is very typical with vertical handhelds. And I gotta say, the ergonomics here work pretty well. It definitely is more comfortable than most other vertical devices, and because of the grips, it certainly feels less cramped. However, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the design here just wasn't really complete. It almost feels like the design team got about 75% of the way there. You know, they made these grips, they kind of put them in an angle, and then they said, you know what? That's good enough. And so it's definitely an improvement here, but I would not characterize it as being optimal. Now, among this design, there is one glaring flaw, and that is the shoulder buttons. I think the design here is good. It's very easy to access and press those buttons, but that kind of is the rub. The L1 and R1 shoulder buttons are a little bit too easy to accidentally press with the sides of your fingers. And as I demonstrated in my preview video, there were many times when I was playing a game where all of a sudden I would accidentally press a button and it would mess up my gameplay. This is not something that I've ever experienced in another vertical handheld, which I think says something about this particular design. So if anything, I would say just be aware that that may happen, and you may have to adjust the way that you hold it or play those certain games. Okay, going back to the color thing here, you know, I only have 2 of the 3 models, but all the same, I did find that I had a preference between these 2 in particular. And I found it kind of odd because I love the wood model. In fact, the RG405V, which is a previous vertical handheld that Anbernic made, it also had a wood color, and that was my favorite. And I still do like that idea of a wood device, it just seems really odd. However, as soon as I unboxed the gray one, my opinion changed. And that is, I really like that clean look of the gray model. It reminds me a lot, obviously, of a Game Boy DMG. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the buttons are the same color, and it just overall has a very clean look. Now, the wood one is still really eye-catching. You know, if I just pull this out in a room, people would be like, what are you doing with that wooden thing? However, there's just a couple things that make it odd. Number one are those colored buttons. I actually prefer rainbow colored buttons in a lot of my different devices, but it just doesn't make sense for me with a wooden one like this. So if anything, I think I would have preferred black buttons, and I think it's going to be the same case with the transparent purple one. This one also has rainbow colored buttons, and it just looks a little bit odd. So as much as I wanted to prefer the wood model over the gray one, I think that the gray model here is the clear winner, at least for me. Okay, now let's talk about the software experience in case this is your very first handheld ever. When you first turn it on, it's going to have to go through a setup process. And this is pretty easy. You just basically have to choose your language and then let it run its course. It's going to take a little bit less than 3 minutes altogether. After that, you'll be greeted with a typical Android environment where you see your apps on the front page. Now, like I mentioned, mine came with a micro SD card. This is 128 gigabytes, as you can see. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put this card into the device and then just pretend like I've never used one of these before and see how far along I can get. And the process here is pretty simple. After you put the card in, there's a button on the left side. Just tap that and it'll bring up the Android launcher or front end. And after a moment, you'll get a dialog box that'll walk you through the setup process. It's going to ask you to tap on the button that says confirm. From there, it's going to open up an app called RetroArch. It's going to ask for a few permissions to basically be able to access all of the games that are on your SD card. So just go ahead and agree through all those prompts. You'll see a bunch of text scrolling right here. And after that stops, you're good to go. You can now navigate down to the bottom of the menu and select the option that says Quit RetroArch. And if all goes well, it will now have recognized your card and all of the games that are within. From there, you can navigate left or right between the different systems and then enter them by pressing the A button to start up a game. I'm going to scroll through these different systems very quickly just so you get an idea of what you will find on board. Also bear in mind this is the 128 gig card. There is a 256 model as well. Now, at the most rudimentary level, this is all you need to know. You will press the A button to enter any of these systems, then pick out a game, and once you press A, it'll start up that game. From there, once you're done playing that game, you're going to press and hold that center button to bring you back to that home menu. After that, you can navigate to the next game you want to play and then start it right up. You will get this little dialog box asking you whether or not you want to go back to that game you were just playing or start up a new one. But really, that's basically it. It is a pretty simple interface to get through. And from a very basic standpoint, if you want something preloaded with a bunch of games, yes, for the most part, this is going to work. Many of your favorite classics will be available right there in the menu, something like Sonic 2, and they've done a pretty good job with configuring everything. For example, with Game Boy, you can see that they actually have it at the correct aspect ratio. They also did a pretty good job with the various arcade systems, so you will find all of the Neo Geo games and then quite a few other fighting and beat 'em up games within both the MAME and Final Burn Neo catalogs. And it does look like they're trying to improve their games list over time. A great example is going to be Castlevania Symphony of the Night. This is a game that used to ship with a Chinese version. So it had Chinese text and then Japanese audio. Now it appears that they're shipping it with the English language version, which is a great sign. And there are a couple low-level features that they have within this front end. For example, they have 3 different styles. This will change out the feel of the navigation system. Instead of scrolling through different pages of your consoles, you can instead have a tile-based setup. In addition, the front end has 4 different themes that you can choose from. So if you want to have something with a little bit different of a design, you can also choose that. Now, in terms of customization, there's not a lot going on here, but if you have one design that you prefer over the other, it's pretty easy to swap them out. So when it comes down to it, if this is your very first retro handheld, you have no idea how to load up your own games, and you just want to start playing from day one, then yes, buying a preloaded SD card will give you a pretty fair experience. However, I do have to warn you that the more you use it, you're going to start seeing cracks in the overall design and build process. So let's walk you through some of those shortcomings. To start, when it comes to organizing their games list, they are not in alphabetical order. Instead, they've put a bunch of numbers in front of most of these systems. And this can make it really hard to navigate. Instead of going to a specific letter to play a game that you want, you'll have to memorize what number it is instead. In addition, many of these games lists are incomplete. For example, the Super Nintendo catalog basically stops in the middle of the letter R. For other systems, the games list is 100% incomplete. For example, with Nintendo 64, you have 6 different games to choose from. And then same goes with like Sega Dreamcast. You have 4 games here, and Sega Saturn only has 6. So unless you only wanted to play some of the games you just saw, you might be out of luck. In addition, some of the optimizations they've done with these emulators is not ideal. A good example is going to be Sega Saturn. For this one, by default, they set it up with a RetroArch core, and it's not the most performant among them. What that means is that no matter what game you play, you're probably not going to be able to play it at full speed. And that's a big bummer, because if you use the standalone Saturn emulator, you would get many of these games to play at full speed, no problem. So the out-of-the-box experience will not be optimized for certain systems. Now, thankfully, this device does come with the Google Play Store, so you can install your own apps and then run them that way. We'll talk more about that after we're done with this section. When it comes to PlayStation 2, same thing here. We have a very limited catalog, and they have very much so cherry-picked the games that are going to run on the emulator. And another thing they've done here is that they have tweaked and modified those settings to basically turn on all of the hacks so that the games appear to be playing at full speed. For example, they love showing off God of War 2 in their marketing materials. They basically want to show how powerful the device is. However, they've turned on a bunch of hacks by default within the emulator options, and as a result, the gameplay itself is not going to feel very smooth at all. And I think this kind of setup really takes away from the overall experience. Yes, God of War 2 is playable, but I wouldn't want to play it with these settings. And finally, when it comes to catalog, they've also skimped very much so on the GameCube and Wii games. And it makes sense, this is only a 128GB card, so you can't put a ton of games on here. They also have all of these games set up to run the Dolphin MMJR2 version by default. And it's not a bad emulator, but it uses a lot of hacks to try to get to full speed. The thing is that the official Dolphin emulator has gotten a lot of updates recently, and so I prefer to use that one. So what I'm trying to say about this catalog here is that yes, there are a bunch of games preloaded on this card, but it may not be the games that you actually want to play. In addition, the optimizations when it comes to the emulators are not as good as if you just did it yourself. Additionally, once you do find a game that you want to play, the experience may not line up to what you expect. For example, with Contra, they're using a hacked version, so as soon as your character dies, he's actually going to start with the spread gun instead of the normal one. And so this may not be great for you if you want a more authentic Contra experience, because you can't turn this off. Other games will come in a different language. For example, instead of Mega Man 2, you get Rockman 2. This is the Japanese version of the game. And the gameplay here is identical to the English version, but all the same, if you want to read the text, it's going to be a little bit hard. In addition, especially within the NES catalog, there are a bunch of hacks and unlicensed games. For example, here, this one is called Contra Special 2. This looks like an NES port version of Contra 3 Alien Wars from the Super Nintendo, but it looks pretty terrible if you ask me. Same thing with this one here. I'm pretty sure they never actually released Tekken 2 for the NES. Now, another feature they've built into the Anbernic front end is a search function. To bring this up, you press the start button. However, you cannot do that within the global configuration. You have to go into a specific system first. So you can't just search for a Zelda game and then have every system show up. You have to go specifically into a system and then search for the word Zelda. However, once you search for it within the system, yeah, it pops up just fine. You can then choose the game and start it right up. So this is a pretty easy way to mitigate the fact that they've numbered most of their games lists. However, one thing that's kind of funny about the Anbernic system is that they always remove all of the Mario games, or at least any game that has the word Mario in it. And I think it's their way of trying to avoid any sort of litigation from Nintendo, but it's just kind of ironic. So you're not going to be able to find Mario games on this device, but you search for the other Nintendo properties like Kirby, yeah, those pop right up. Now, the reason why I'm talking so much about this software experience is because it's one of the most common questions that I find in all of these review videos. People just want to buy a device and have a card and load it all up and just be able to start up their games without having to do any extra work. And as I showed, yes, at a very basic level, that is going to work. You put the card inside, you will have some games to choose from. However, as I showed as well, there are some flaws to this overall design, and they really didn't source these ROMs very well. At the end of the day, it's a very shady thing that Anbernic has put all these pirated games on a card and are trying to upcharge that anyway. The way I see it, if they're going to be shady like that, the least they could do is actually get it right, and unfortunately here they have not. So long story short, like with all my other videos, I do recommend that you set this up yourself. That includes finding your own ROM files. Obviously I'm not going to show you how to do that, but it is pretty easy to do. From there, you need to find all your emulation apps and then tie it all together with a front-end experience. Luckily, I have a bunch of written guides and videos that'll walk you through that process. I'll leave the entire thing linked down below. And I already went through and did that process on the wooden RG405V, as you can see right here. I'm using a front end called Digisho. This is one of many that's available right now. And essentially, this will combine all your systems together, and then you can point it to your ROMs and then choose which emulator app you want to run them with. From there, it's just a matter of navigating through, choosing your game, and starting it right up. The main difference here is that you get to choose and curate your own games yourself, and you get to dictate which emulator opens them up so you have the most optimized experience. And I'm not really going to show a lot of performance in this video here, but if you watch my preview video, you know that you can play up to GameCube and PS2. Maybe about 50% of those games will play just fine. If you want to get even better performance, you can go in and start tweaking some settings. Then the number's going to creep up more to about 75%, and that's pretty awesome. Now, in addition to the emulation experience, this is also an Android-based device, which means that you can play Android games. However, that experience is not as great as I was hoping it would be. They have made some adjustments to the software, so for example, when trying to play game streaming, the L2 and R2 buttons now work. In a lot of their previous software, it wouldn't work at all, and that's really important when it comes to streaming a game that's going to be using those trigger buttons. So I am happy to see that that experience has improved. However, there are still some issues with their initial software. For example, many games that do support controllers don't actually work with the controllers on the device. And they do have a button mapping option within their software so that you can just kind of fake it, but all the same, I wish it just worked out of the box. In addition, there are some weird graphical things that are happening with certain games. Diablo Immortal is a great example. This one should work natively with the controls, but they don't. And then also you can see here the graphics are completely screwed. So this is a game you should be able to run on this device, but you cannot. Now, thankfully, there is a custom Android firmware available for a few of these devices. It is called Gamma OS. I've made a couple videos about it already. For example, here is my RG405M using the exact same chip and screen, but with Gamma OS, and as you can see, Diablo Immortal works just fine. The controls and the screen look great. So there are still some shortcomings when it comes to the Android software on the RG405V. Thankfully, the Gamma OS developer has one of these devices, so we may see Gamma OS coming to this device here in the near future. So that's my summary of the expected software experience. Now, some other components, things like performance, hardware, ergonomics, I covered all that in the preview video, and so I don't want to beat a dead horse. Instead, I want to spend the rest of our time together here today talking about whether or not I think it's going to be worth buying this device compared to other ones on the market. So we're going to start with a quick comparison of the four main contenders within this price point and chipset. Now, these four devices are not the only ones that come with the same chipset and a similar price point. There are other devices, the RG505, the Powkiddy X28, as well as the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus Metal Edition. I've done videos on each of those and you can find them here on this channel, but for now I want to focus really narrowly on these four devices because they're my favorite within this chipset. And from a power perspective, you can expect the exact same performance among all of these, so we won't even touch upon it here in this review. Now, before we get into the comparison, one other thing I want to mention is that I do have a slight negative bias towards vertical handhelds as a primary device. When it comes to smaller devices, you know, like a Miu Mini Plus or an RG35XX, I think those are just fine when it comes to a vertical form factor. However, if it's going to be your only handheld device, for me personally, I don't think a vertical is a very good fit. However, if you like vertical handhelds and you prefer them over the others, then take a lot of this with a grain of salt because you might have a different opinion than me. Again, I'm coming from a little bit of a negative bias, especially when it comes to these vertical handhelds. With that out of the way, let's do our quick comparison. It's kind of like a 2-in-2 comparison because the RG405M, which is this smaller device right here, has the exact same screen and controls as the RG405V. Obviously, it's also made by Anbernic. Meanwhile, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and the Retroid Pocket Flip are a little bit similar as well. They have the exact same screen and of course same performance. Now among all of these, I think that the color and saturation of these panels is very good, but a little bit better with the Retroid products. It's a little bit more saturated, and I also like the color balance. You can see that the purple here in Game Boy Advance is just a little bit more purple. I would say that the Anbernic products skew a little bit on the cool side. That's why the purple looks a little bit more blue. However, if you only have these devices and you're not comparing them side by side, it's going to look great no matter what. So I don't think it's worth dwelling on the color balance right here. I think it's just fine. I think that the biggest difference between all of these is not going to be something like the color balance or the performance. It's going to be the size and form factor. And to start by looking at the RG405M, you can see it is a night and day difference when it comes to size. To me, the 405M size is a completely pocketable device. It's one of my favorite devices to just kind of grab and go. To me, the 405V is not even something that I would take out of the house. It's so big that it's really more like a couch gaming or a bed gaming setup. However, there are some things that I like better on the 405V than the 405M. For example, I prefer to have the D-pad up top with these systems. In addition, I'm not a huge fan of the inline shoulder buttons on this device. I do appreciate the fact that they make the device very thin and pocketable, and honestly, with a device this small, it's not like they're hard to press down on. But all the same, I do prefer stacked shoulder buttons, and the 405V gives me a closer experience than this one. So the way I see it, if size is a primary concern for you, but you still want to have that 4-inch display with a 4:3 aspect ratio, I think it's a no-brainer between these two. I would prefer the RG405M. I personally think that if you had both of these devices and you spent a lot of time on the go, you're going to use the 405M a lot more. It's just going to be something you can throw in your pocket, which means you're going to have more opportunities to actually play it. And it's also a pretty similar experience with the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. This one is also really nice and thin, and I also would consider it to be pocketable. It is quite a bit wider than these other devices because it has a 16:9 aspect ratio display. And this can actually be a pretty big advantage depending on the type of games you want to play. For example, if you prefer PlayStation Portable games, or you want to do some game streaming or Android games, or maybe some light Nintendo Switch emulation, then the 3 Plus is going to be the best fit. It also has the D-pad up top and stacked shoulder buttons. So if those factors are important to you, this one might be a better fit than the 405V. Now, if you're looking for a vertical handheld, and you might very well be if you clicked on this video, then I think that the Retroid Pocket Flip is going to be your closest approximation other than the RG405V. This one has a clamshell form factor, which means it's going to close up pretty tightly compared to the Anbernic device. However, the added benefit here is that when you open it up, it's actually quite a bit bigger. So it makes it both portable, but then also kind of luxurious in the fact that you have plenty of space to work with. So if you are looking for a more vertical orientation, but want to have a roomier experience while still keeping it a little bit portable, then the Retroid Pocket Flip might actually be a great fit for you. And I've done a couple different videos on that device, and so I would recommend checking them out here on this channel. So here's the way I see it. There are a ton of different options within this chipset, and these 4 here are my favorite, although the others are still pretty good. And if you already have any of these other devices, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to spend about $150 to get the 405V in particular. Even if you prefer vertical handhelds, that's a lot of money to spend just to have a different form factor. However, if this is your very first time buying a device within this chipset, I wouldn't recommend the RG405V as your starter handheld. Instead, I would probably say the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus first, then the RG405M. And those two I think are the best general starter devices among this chipset. However, if you have a form factor preference, for example, you prefer clamshells, then obviously the Retroid Pocket Flip is going to be a good fit. And then same thing now with the RG405V. If you want to have a vertical handheld, you want something very ergonomic and powerful, this is it right here. And the overall experience here is not bad. There are some flaws here and there, but all the same, I think that if you do spend the money to get this device and you prefer to have a vertical handheld, I think you're going to be pretty impressed and happy with your overall purchase. As always, when it comes down to it, it's going to be up to you and your personal preference, especially when it comes to form factor. Because other than this vertical kind of Game Boy aesthetic, there's nothing really new about the RG405V. All the same, I think there are a lot of people out there who have been waiting for something with this specific shape and size, and so in that regard, yeah, this might be a great upgrade. For me personally, I don't think we found the perfect device within this chipset and price range. If I was king for a day, what I would really like to have is a plastic version of the Anbernic RG405M. But of course, if I'm king, then I'm also going to make a couple tweaks. Number one, I'm going to swap out that left analog stick with the D-pad. And then of course, instead of that heavy aluminum shell, I would prefer lightweight plastic. It would probably bring down the price as well. Additionally, I would have them add an HDMI output. Unfortunately, it's not here on this device or the 405V. Additionally, I would change out these shoulder buttons. Instead of having them in line like this, I would rather have them stacked. And it just so happens that there are designs that you can print yourself with a 3D printer that gives the RG405M stacked shoulder buttons. So Anbernic, if you're listening, you should really download this file and see what you can do. And as we start wrapping up things right here, yes, the 405V is an excellent device. And if you don't have anything that's this powerful and you want to kind of upgrade to a larger and more comfortable handheld that's in a vertical orientation, then yes, this is going to be a great upgrade. However, if you already have a device with the T618 chipset, I really don't see it being worth that $150 after shipping to get this one in your hands. I think the best way to describe it is that over this past week, I enjoyed using the RG405V. However, as soon as this video is done, I'm going to be putting this device up on a shelf, and I'm probably not going to grab it very often other than when it comes to testing and size comparisons with other devices. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is this the device to get at that $150 price point, or are you going to wait for something better? And as you know, if you wait a month or two, there's obviously going to be something else released. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we'll see you next time. Happy gaming.